The Disappearing Campers. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. 5 friends had planned a camping trip deep in the woods, far from the stress and noise of civilization. They packed their gear, loaded up their cars, and set out on the winding dirt road that led to their destination. At first, everything was perfect. They set up their tents, started a campfire, and cracked open some beers. They hiked during the day, swam in the nearby lake, and laughed around the fire at night. But then, things started to go wrong. The first sign that something was amiss came on the second night. One of the friends, a girl named Emily, vanished from her tent in the middle of the night. The others searched for her frantically, but she was nowhere to be found. They assumed that she had wandered off to use the bathroom or take a walk, but as the hours ticked by, their concern turned to terror. The next morning, they called the authorities, but the search team found no trace of Emily. She was just gone. The friends tried to comfort each other, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Another friend, a guy named Jake, disappeared while gathering firewood. The remaining 3 tried to stay calm and rational, but as they heard strange noises and saw shadowy figures moving in the trees, they knew that they were in real danger. As they sat around the dwindling campfire, the survivors began to realize that they might not make it out alive. They wondered if they were being stalked by a wild animal or a psychopath, or worse, if the woods themselves were cursed or haunted by an ancient evil. Days turned into nights, and the friends became increasingly desperate. They tried to ration their food and water, but as their supplies dwindled, they knew that they couldn't stay in the woods forever. They hiked through the trees, trying to find their way back to civilization, but the deeper they went, the more lost they became. Finally, on the 4th night, the last 2 friends, a couple named Mike and Sarah, were sitting by the fire when they heard a rustling in the bushes. They grabbed their knives and stood up, ready to fight for their lives. But as the figure emerged from the darkness, they realized that it wasn't an animal or a killer. It was Emily. She stumbled into the clearing, dirty and bruised, but alive. She told them a story of being lost and disoriented in the woods, but somehow managing to survive by foraging and hiding from whatever was stalking them. As they hugged each other in relief, they realized that they had made it out alive, but they also knew that they could never forget the horrors that they had faced in the deep woods, and that they would never be the same again. Emily's return was a glimmer of hope in the darkness, but it also raised more questions than answers. How had she survived for days in the woods without any supplies? And what had happened to Jake, the friend who had vanished without a trace? The group huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. They shared their theories about what might be stalking them in the woods, from wild animals to supernatural beings. But as they spoke, they knew that they were still in danger. They decided to pack up their camp and start moving, hoping to find a way out of the woods. But as they walked, they felt as if they were being watched, as if something was following them through the trees. They heard strange noises, saw flashes of movement in the shadows, and felt the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. As they hiked, their food and water supplies dwindled, and they grew weaker with each passing day. They began to argue and bicker, blaming each other for their predicament. They knew that they needed to work together to survive, but the stress and fear were tearing them apart. Finally, on the 6th day, they stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing was a small cabin, with smoke rising from the chimney. It looked abandoned, but it was the only sign of civilization that they had seen in days. Cautiously, they approached the cabin, hoping to find some supplies or a way to call for help. But as they got closer, they saw that the cabin was not empty. There were signs of recent activity, and they could hear faint whispers coming from inside. Mike and Sarah, the couple who had been so hopeful when Emily returned, were the first to enter the cabin. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by a scene of horror. Jake's body was lying on the floor, surrounded by candles and symbols that they couldn't decipher, and standing in the shadows was a figure draped in a cloak and holding a bloody knife. The figure turned towards them, revealing a face that was twisted and grotesque. It was something that none of them had ever seen before, something that defied explanation or understanding. And as it began to advance towards them, they knew that they were facing a horror that could not be defeated. The last thing that they heard was the sound of laughter echoing through the cabin and into the woods, and then everything went black. When the group regained consciousness, they found themselves tied up in the cabin with no idea how much time had passed. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but they could hear its whispers in the darkness. They tried to break free, but the ropes were tight and their hands were numb. They were thirsty, hungry, and scared. They didn't know if they would ever make it out of the woods alive. As the hours ticked by, they heard strange noises outside the cabin. They heard screams, howls, and otherworldly sounds that made their skin crawl. They knew that they were not alone in the woods, that there were other horrors out there waiting to claim them. And then, just when they thought that all hope was lost, they heard a sound that they recognized. It was the sound of a helicopter hovering overhead. They screamed and shouted, trying to get the attention of the rescue team, but the helicopter flew past them, its searchlight scanning the trees. They tried to shout again, but their voices were hoarse. They were too weak to move, too scared to hope. And then, just when they thought that they were doomed to die in the woods, they heard footsteps outside the cabin. They heard voices calling their names. They felt hands on their shoulders, pulling them to safety. The rescue team had found them just in time. They were taken to a hospital where they were treated for dehydration, starvation, and exposure. They were traumatized, but alive. They tried to explain what had happened in the woods, but nobody believed them. They were dismissed as delusional or hysterical, their story relegated to a footnote in the local news. But they knew the truth. They knew that there were horrors out there, lurking in the deep woods, waiting to claim unsuspecting victims. And they knew that they would never forget the nightmare that they had lived through. Before we go on with the stories, I remind you to like the video and subscribe to support the channel. The Cursed Woods. Deep in the heart of the forest, there lies a cursed land that has long been shrouded in mystery and terror. For centuries, the woods have been known to be home to unspeakable horrors, and those who enter its depths have never returned. But the people of the nearby town were never ones to believe in such superstitions. They built their homes on the edge of the forest, and soon enough, they began to venture into the woods, eager to explore its secrets. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The woods were dark and foreboding, but the townspeople were undeterred. They found streams and wildlife, and even uncovered old ruins buried deep in the forest floor. It seemed like a paradise. But then strange things began to happen. People started disappearing without a trace, and those who returned had a haunted look in their eyes. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers in the darkness, and of an overwhelming feeling of dread that never left them. As the days passed, the curse began to spread. Strange creatures emerged from the forest, stalking the outskirts of the town and picking off the townspeople one by one. The forest seemed to be alive with malevolence, and the people realized too late that they had awakened an ancient evil that should never have been disturbed. Those who remained alive fought for their survival, barricading their homes and fortifying their borders. But it was no use. The forest was relentless, and the creatures that lurked within its depths were unstoppable. The once vibrant town was reduced to rubble and ashes, and the forest claimed its prize forevermore. As the years passed, people whispered of the cursed woods and the terrible fate that had befallen the town. They warned others to never venture too close to the cursed land, lest they too become consumed by the forest's insatiable hunger. Despite the warnings, there were always those who thought they could conquer the cursed woods, those who believed they could uncover its secrets and emerge unscathed. One such person was a young man named Mark. Mark had always been fascinated by the stories of the cursed woods, and he had spent years studying maps and legends to try and uncover the truth behind the curse. He was convinced that he could be the one to break the curse and put an end to the terror that plagued the land. With a sense of determination, Mark set out on his quest, venturing deep into the heart of the cursed forest. He walked for hours, his footsteps echoing through the woods as he pushed deeper and deeper into the unknown. As the night began to fall, Mark realized he had made a mistake. The woods were darker and more foreboding than he had imagined, and the silence was suffocating. He tried to retrace his steps, but the forest seemed to have other plans. Mark soon found himself lost, wandering through a maze of trees that seemed to shift and move on their own. He tried to shout for help, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness, leaving him alone and afraid. And then he heard it, a faint whisper in the darkness, a voice that seemed to be coming from all around him. It spoke of ancient evil and cursed lands, of creatures that lurked in the shadows and hungered for the blood of the living. As the night wore on, Mark stumbled upon a clearing where a small cabin stood. It was old and decrepit, but Mark thought it might offer some refuge from the horrors that lurked in the woods. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, grateful for the shelter. But he soon realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The cabin was haunted by the ghosts of its former inhabitants, who had been consumed by the curse and now sought revenge on any who dared to enter their domain. Mark tried to leave, but the ghosts blocked his path, their ghastly forms glowing in the darkness. He realized too late that he had been lured into a trap, a sacrificial offering to the cursed forest. And so, Mark became just another victim of the cursed woods, his fate sealed by his own foolishness and his desire to uncover the secrets of the ancient land. The cursed forest remained, a dark and foreboding place that whispered of unspeakable horrors and ancient evil, a place that would forever be remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when one tempts fate and awakens a curse that should have been left alone. Years passed, and the cursed forest continued to claim victims, its hunger never sated. But there were those who refused to give up on the land, those who were determined to uncover the truth behind the curse and put an end to the terror that plagued the woods. One such person was a young woman named Emily. She had grown up hearing the stories of the cursed woods, but unlike many others, she was not afraid. She saw the land as a mystery to be solved, a puzzle to be unraveled. With a sense of purpose, Emily set out on her own quest, venturing deep into the heart of the cursed forest. She walked for hours, her footsteps echoing through the woods as she searched for any clues that might shed light on the curse. As the night began to fall, Emily realized she was lost. The woods were darker and more foreboding than she had imagined, and the silence was deafening. But unlike Mark, Emily did not give up. She pushed on, determined to find a way out of the cursed forest. And then she saw it, a glimmer of light in the darkness, a beacon of hope that seemed to call to her. She followed the light, her heart racing with anticipation, until she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its roots twisting and turning into the earth. Emily approached the tree, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. She reached out and touched the bark, and in that moment, she felt a surge of energy coursing through her body. Suddenly, Emily understood. The curse was not an evil force to be feared, but a natural phenomenon, a cycle of life and death that had been interrupted by the townspeople. The cursed forest was simply a land that had been left to its own devices, a place where the cycle of life and death continued as it always had. Emily knew what she had to do. She gathered the townspeople and explained the truth behind the curse. She urged them to leave the cursed forest alone, to let it return to its natural state. And slowly but surely, the curse began to lift. The trees no longer shifted and moved on their own, and the creatures that had once roamed the woods began to disappear. The townspeople were grateful to Emily, who had shown them the way, and they vowed to never again disturb the natural order of the land. And so, the cursed woods became a place of peace and tranquility, a land where the cycle of life and death continued as it always had. And Emily became a legend, a hero who had unlocked the secret of the cursed forest and restored balance to the land. The Haunted Cabin. The Jones family was excited to escape their busy city life for a relaxing weekend getaway in a secluded cabin in the deep woods. As they arrived, they noticed something strange about the cabin. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up, giving the cabin a foreboding appearance. Despite their unease, the family decided to settle in and make the most of their vacation. But as the sun began to set, strange things started to happen. Doors would creak open on their own, and footsteps could be heard on the wooden floorboards, even when no one was around. At first, the family tried to brush it off, attributing the noises to the old cabin's natural creaks and groans. But when their youngest daughter, Emily, woke up in the middle of the night, screaming and pointing at the wall, they knew something was wrong. The wall seemed to be pulsing, almost as if it were breathing. As the family watched in horror, the wall began to crack, and a cold mist poured into the room, filling it with an eerie chill. That's when they saw them. The ghosts of the cabin's former inhabitants had awakened and were now haunting the family. The Joneses tried to flee, but the ghosts seemed to be everywhere, trapping them in the cabin. As the night wore on, the ghosts grew more and more aggressive, tormenting the family with visions of their own deaths. The family was terrified and desperate for a way out, but the ghosts were not going to let them go. By morning, the family was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained by the terror they had endured. They decided to make one last effort to escape, but as they opened the front door, they found themselves face to face with the ghosts. The ghosts had no intention of letting the family leave, and as they closed in, the Joneses knew that they were doomed to spend eternity trapped in the haunted cabin. The family was frozen in fear as the ghost drew closer and closer. They could feel the cold breath of the spirits on their faces, sending shivers down their spines. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, and a voice boomed from nowhere, commanding the spirits to release the family. The ghost hesitated, unsure of what to do. The light grew brighter and brighter until it enveloped the entire cabin. As the light faded, the family found themselves standing outside the cabin, surrounded by a group of people dressed in white robes. The leader of the group explained that they were a group of paranormal investigators who had been tracking the spirits for years. The investigators had been called to the cabin by the spirits themselves, who were desperate to be released from their curse. The investigators had performed a ritual that had banished the spirits from the cabin forever. The family was relieved to be free from the haunted cabin and thanked the investigators for their help. As they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching them from the shadows. Years later, the Joneses would look back on their weekend in the woods as the scariest experience of their lives. They never forgot the feeling of being trapped in the haunted cabin, and they never ventured into the deep woods again. The cabin remained abandoned for years, until one day a group of teenagers stumbled upon it. They broke in, looking for a place to party, but they were never seen again. The locals whispered that the cabin was still haunted by the ghosts of its former inhabitants, waiting for their next victims to come and join them in their eternal prison. The missing search party. It was a clear summer morning when the volunteers set out to search for the missing person in the deep woods. They were all eager to help and felt a sense of purpose as they ventured deeper into the forest. But as they delved deeper into the woods, things began to take a turn for the worse. At first, it was small things that they noticed, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, but as the day wore on, the phenomena became more frequent and intense. Strange voices echoed through the trees, and shadows darted through the underbrush. Some of the volunteers even reported seeing ghostly apparitions. As they searched, the volunteers began to feel as though they were being watched. Every time they turned around, they felt a presence looming over them, but they could never quite catch a glimpse of what was causing it. The woods seemed to close in around them, and they felt as though they were trapped in a nightmare. As night fell, the volunteers huddled together, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. They knew that they needed to keep moving if they were going to find the missing person, but they were terrified to go any deeper into the woods. They tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal and their radios were silent. One by one, the volunteers began to disappear. They would suddenly vanish without a trace, leaving the others to wonder what was happening to them. As the group grew smaller, the survivors began to realize that they may not be alone in the woods after all, and that something was hunting them. They pressed on, desperate to find a way out of the woods, but the woods seemed to be alive, twisting and turning around them, leading them in circles. The survivors were exhausted, hungry, and terrified, and they began to doubt that they would ever make it out alive. As dawn broke on the second day, the survivors stumbled upon a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing stood the missing person, alive but catatonic. They quickly scooped the person up and made a run for it, fleeing the woods as fast as they could. Even though the search party had found the missing person alive, their experience in the woods had left them deeply scarred. They had witnessed things that they could not explain, and they knew that they had narrowly escaped with their lives. As the survivors tried to recover from their ordeal, they began to hear stories of other search parties that had gone missing in the same woods. Some claimed that the woods were cursed, while others believed that there was something far more sinister at work. One survivor, a man named John, became obsessed with finding out what had happened to the other search parties. He began to spend all his time researching the history of the woods, poring over old maps and journals, and talking to anyone who would listen. As he delved deeper into the woods' history, John began to uncover a dark and disturbing past. The woods had once been home to a group of settlers who had been driven out by a brutal massacre. Legend had it that the ghosts of the settlers still haunted the woods, seeking revenge on those who dared to trespass on their land. John became convinced that the search parties had been lured into the woods by the ghost, and that they had been taken as revenge for the settlers' deaths. He gathered a new group of volunteers and set out to investigate, determined to put an end to the curse once and for all. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, John and his group began to experience the same strange phenomena that the first search party had encountered. They heard ghostly voices, saw shadows darting through the trees, and felt a sense of dread that hung over them like a pall. As they pressed on, the group began to split up, with some members venturing off on their own in search of answers. One by one, they began to disappear, leaving John alone and terrified in the dark woods. Just as he was about to give up hope, John stumbled upon an old cabin in the woods. As he cautiously approached the cabin, he heard a faint whisper in his ear. "Leave now," the voice said. "You are not welcome here." But John refused to leave. He was determined to uncover the truth about the woods, no matter the cost. He pushed open the door to the cabin and stepped inside. What he found inside the cabin would haunt him for the rest of his days. The walls were covered in symbols of ancient magic, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the room lay the remains of the other search parties, their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural positions. And standing in the shadows was the ghostly figure of a settler, his eyes burning with a fierce hatred. "You should have listened," he said, as he reached out to claim John's soul. The woods claimed another victim that day, and John's body was never found. But the legend of the cursed woods lived on, and people whispered of the vengeful spirits that still roamed the forest at night. Years after John's disappearance, the woods remained shrouded in mystery and terror. Local residents warned visitors to stay away, and those who did venture into the woods rarely returned. But one day, a group of urban explorers arrived in town, eager to uncover the truth about the cursed woods. They were young and fearless, and they believed that they could uncover the secrets that others had failed to find. They heard strange noises in the darkness, saw shadows moving through the trees, and felt an oppressive weight on their shoulders. Despite the warnings, they pressed on, driven by a desire to uncover the truth. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, they found themselves hopelessly lost, unable to find their way back to civilization. One by one, they began to disappear, just like the search parties and John before them. They heard ghostly whispers in their ears, felt icy fingers on their skin, and saw visions of the dead rising from the earth. As they stumbled through the darkness, the explorers realized that they had become trapped in the cursed woods, unable to escape the vengeful spirits that roamed the forest. And then, just when they thought that all was lost, they saw a glimmer of light in the distance. They stumbled towards it, desperate for salvation, and found themselves standing before the old cabin where John had met his gruesome fate. As they pushed open the door, they were greeted by the sight of the ancient symbols and the rotting corpses that lay within. And standing in the center of the room was the ghostly figure of John himself, his eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "You should not have come here," he said, as the other spirits closed in around the explorers. "The woods will never let you leave." And with that, the explorers were swallowed up by the darkness, never to be seen again. The cursed woods had claimed another set of victims, and the cycle of terror continued unabated. The dark forest. The family had been hiking for hours, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the dense forest around them. But as the sun began to set, they realized they had lost their way. Panic set in as they realized they were alone, with no food or water, and the darkness was closing in around them. As they stumbled through the thick underbrush, they began to hear strange noises all around them, rustling in the trees, scratching at the undergrowth, and low, guttural growls that sent shivers down their spines. They tried to keep moving, hoping to find a way out, but the forest seemed to have a life of its own, and the trees seemed to be closing in around them. As night fell, the family huddled together, trying to stay warm and safe. But the darkness only seemed to make the forest more terrifying. They could hear the sound of footsteps all around them, but when they looked, they saw only shadowy figures lurking in the trees. Just as they were beginning to lose hope, they saw a flicker of light in the distance. Desperate for help, they stumbled towards the light, hoping it would lead them to safety. But as they drew closer, they realized that the light was coming from an abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the heart of the forest. The family hesitated, knowing that the cabin might not be safe. But with no other options, they ventured inside. The cabin was dark and musty, with creaking floorboards and ancient furniture. As they tried to make themselves comfortable, they realized that they were not alone. The shadows seemed to dance around them, taking on strange and twisted shapes. The family could feel something watching them, something malevolent and dangerous. They huddled together, waiting for morning to come, praying that they would survive the night. But morning never came. When the rescue team finally found the family, they were cold and lifeless, huddled together in the corner of the cabin. The forest had claimed them, as it had claimed so many others before them, its darkness and terror too much for them to bear. The rescue team could hardly believe their eyes as they looked at the lifeless bodies of the family. They had heard stories about the dark forest before, but they had never seen the evidence of its power and terror firsthand. They knew that the forest was a place of great danger where people could disappear without a trace, never to be seen again. As they searched the cabin for clues, they found a note that the family had written before they died. It read, "We are being watched. Something is in the forest with us, something that wants to hurt us. We can hear it growling and scratching outside the door. We are afraid that we will not make it through the night." The rescue team shuddered as they read the note, knowing that they had come too late to save the family. They packed up their gear and began to make their way back to civilization, knowing that the forest was a place of great danger, a place that they would never forget. As they drove away from the dark forest, they looked back one last time, wondering what secrets lay hidden within its depths. They knew that the forest was a place of great mystery and terror, a place where the darkness could swallow you whole and never let you go. And so, the legend of the dark forest continued, a place of great danger and mystery, a place that would forever be etched in the memories of those who dared to venture within its depths. For those who entered the forest, there was no guarantee of ever making it out alive. Over the years, the legend of the dark forest grew, with tales of other hikers and adventurers who had ventured into its depths, only to never return. Some spoke of hearing strange whispers in the wind, while others claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking in the trees. Despite the warnings, some still dared to venture into the forest, drawn by its mysterious allure. But as more and more people disappeared, the local authorities began to take notice. They formed search parties, combing through the forest for any signs of the missing, but their efforts always proved futile. Rumors began to spread of a curse upon the forest, with some claiming that it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died within its depths. Others claimed that the forest was home to a secret society of witches and warlocks who practiced dark magic and sacrificed innocent victims to their dark gods. But no one knew the truth of what lay within the dark forest, and the mystery only grew deeper with each passing year. The forest remained a place of great danger, a place that no one dared to enter unless they had a death wish. For those who dared to enter the forest, they knew that they might never return, and that the forest would always hold its secrets close to its heart. The Witch's Lair. The woods were dark and foreboding as the group of teenagers made their way deeper into the forest. They had heard stories of an old abandoned house that was rumored to be haunted by a witch, and they were determined to find it. As they reached the outskirts of the woods, they saw the old house looming in the distance. It was a dilapidated old structure with crumbling walls and broken windows. The air around it seemed thick and heavy, as though something was watching them. The group cautiously made their way inside, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. As they explored the house, they began to experience strange and terrifying phenomena. Doors slammed shut behind them, and cold spots seemed to follow them around the house. They heard eerie whispers and saw shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. It wasn't long before they realized that they had awoken an ancient evil. They could feel a malevolent presence in the house, and they knew that they were not alone. They tried to leave, but the doors and windows seemed to be sealed shut. They were trapped. As the night wore on, the group began to see the witch herself. She was a twisted and gnarled old woman with glowing eyes and long, bony fingers. She seemed to be everywhere at once, whispering curses and casting spells. The group huddled together, trying to come up with a plan to escape. But as the witch closed in on them, they realized that they might not make it out alive. They had awakened an ancient evil, and now they were paying the price. In the end, only one of them managed to escape. He looked back at the old house. He saw the witch's glowing eyes staring back at him from the window. He never spoke of what he saw that night, but the memory of the witch's lair haunted him for years to come. He knew that he had come face to face with true evil, and he had barely escaped with his life. The survivor of the witch's lair tried to put the experience behind him, but the memory of that night continued to haunt him. He had nightmares about the old witch and the malevolent presence that had trapped him and his friends in the abandoned house. He tried to convince himself that it had all been a figment of his imagination, that he had imagined the whispers and the glowing eyes of the witch. But deep down, he knew that what he had experienced had been all too real. One day, he received a call from one of his old friends from the group that had gone to the witch's lair with him. The friend had been trying to track down the rest of the group, and he had discovered that they had all died under mysterious circumstances. The survivor was stunned. He had never known what had happened to the rest of the group after that fateful night in the woods. His friend told him that they had all died within a year of the incident, and that each death had been preceded by strange and terrifying occurrences. The survivor knew then that the witch's lair was not just a figment of his imagination. He had been lucky to escape with his life, but the rest of his friends had not been so fortunate. He felt a sense of guilt for having led them into that old house and for having unwittingly awoken an ancient evil. He knew that he could never forget what had happened in the woods that night. The memory of the witch's lair would stay with him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the true horror that lurks in the deep woods. Thanks for tuning into our scary story today. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more spooky tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on at night.